Hi there, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about the Peugeot Citroen PSA 1.2 Puretech engine, fitted to numerous amounts of Peugeot Citroens from around 2012 onwards, but also fitted to a number of other cars, including a lot of the Vauxhalls range as well. Now the reason for this video is for me as a dealer to highlight what the issues are with this engine, which you might not know, and it's a really important one because, like I said, this engine is in so many vehicles out there, like I said, in the Peugeot, Citroen and Vauxhall ranges. And it is now becoming widely known that it seems to have a numerous amount of issues and faults, something that us in the trade have known for a number of years and I've seen firsthand, and which is one of the reasons why, as a car dealer, I will not buy any vehicle fitted with that engine. So let's talk about what the issues are, what the problems are, what you need to look out for, and if you do own one, what you can try and do to minimize any issues going forward. So let's talk about first the engine itself and the history behind it and why it came about. Now the engine came out in 2012 and was launched into the Citroen C3 and later into the Peugeot 208, but then went on to go into pretty much every other Peugeot Citroen and DS in the range, and then later into the Vauxhalls. The engine was designed to be a replacement for the old Peugeot Citroen TU engine, which had been around for around 30 odd years plus, and was a decent little reliable engine, but it was getting on a bit and was struggling to meet new legislation in regards to emissions, fuel efficiency, and obviously was never managed to get into the right tax bands as well to save on road tax. So a new engine was designed and born, and it came out in 2012, first of all in the Citroen C3. It came out in 1 litre petrol form, 998cc, and also a 1.2 variant. Both were normally aspirated. However, they did design turbocharged versions of the 1.2 version, which would later go on to be fitted to pretty much all the Peugeot, Citroen and Vauxhall ranges. And with the turbocharger fitted, it increased the power dramatically, from around 68 horsepower in the 1 litre, the 1.2 about 70 to 80 horsepower, depending on which version you bought. But with the turbocharged 1.2 versions, that pumped it up to 155 brake in some of the later marks. Now this engine was extremely lightweight, with being 3 cylinders, which made it extremely efficient, great on emissions, means it got cheap road tax as well. Now overall, this sounds a really great idea, having a very fuel efficient, powerful small engine that's cheap to tax and run. However, you do also need reliability, and this is where this engine, the 1.2 in particular we're going to be talking about, does seem to fall down. Now the 1 litre Peugeot Puretech engine, which came out in the early days, fitted in the Citroen C3 in 208, eventually sort of faded away, and was basically the 1.2 is the main thing we're going to talk about today. Pretty much both the same engines anyway, but like I said, the 1 litre didn't have much of a lifespan. The 1.2 is now the staple throughout the Peugeot, Citroen and Vauxhall range. Now we didn't hear much going on in the motor trade itself for the first few years this engine was launched. Bear in mind, most of these cars are going to be stuck with the dealers, they're being serviced on fleet or lease, etc. So they're going back to the main agents where they're being looked after and cared for. So in those early days, you're not going to find too much information about what's going on if there's any faults. And let's be honest, these are new engines. It's a given that there are going to be teething issues, teething problems that are going to be rectified, and the main agents will pick up on that. They report back to the engineers, and they obviously come up with ideas and ways to fix the engine, fault finding, service bulletins, etc., to try and iron out any issues with a new launch engine. That is just a given. However, it is one thing being able to come up with service bulletins and be able to rectify issues as you go along, little minor things here and there, but if there is an actual fundamental design flaw with the engine, then you're going to have a major problem in order to try and basically rectify the problems without going back to the drawing board, which is hugely expensive for manufacturers to do. So moving on a few years later, and these engines are now starting to come out of warranty, and it's getting around sort of 2016, 2017 when we're starting to hear things as dealers that things weren't quite right with this 1.2 engine. We started hearing reports of dealers buying them, having problems with basically cam belt failures, having issues with smoky engines using too much oil starvation problems, basically engines clogging up, numerous amounts of faults and issues, and all extremely expensive to rectify, most of the times needing a new engine. And it's also something that I was witnessing as well. About 2017, I started getting numerous amounts of 208 C3s in particular, particularly mileagey ones, maybe sort of 60, 70,000 miles plus, although I had seen low mileage ones with the same problems as well. Having issues in particular with sort of smoky engines, so when you're trying to rev them up for getting through the MOT test, the emissions, etc., they were absolute bellow out smoke. You could see they were burning oil. The customers were complaining of oil consumption problems, cars coming in with oil lights on, oil pressure faults, and even vehicles turning up with cam belt failure as well. So what are the main issues you need to look out for, the problems with these engines? Well, we've touched on them already, but let's break them down. The first one is oil consumption. So that is the engine basically using too much oil, having to top the engine up with oil in between regular servicing. Now, the vehicle should be serviced around 10 to 12,000 miles, although some specialists are now saying you should be changing it a lot earlier, but the manufacturer recommends around 10 to 12,000 miles. But what seems to be happening with these engines is that people are reporting en masse that they're having to keep putting too much oil in the vehicle, i.e. topping it up constantly, which is not really the normal thing to be doing. Engines do use a little bit of oil, and particularly when they get very high mileage, but when you're getting engines with 20 or 30,000 miles, in some cases only a few years old, guzzling oil, that is not a good sign. In fact, it is not much supposed to be happening at all. Now, Peugeot Citroen do say that the engine should be using around 250 millilitres of oil for every sort of 1,000 miles. That's the sort of max limit that they are putting on that. Now, I doubt that was the case when the engineers designed that engine, but that is the position they are taking now. Anything less than 250 millilitres per 1,000 miles is acceptable. Just to round that up, that is basically 1 litre per every 10,000 miles, which is a little bit excessive in my view. Not a disaster by any means, but it is quite a bit nonetheless. However, lots of people are reporting that they are using far more oil than this guide. In fact, there are plenty of people reporting they're using up to sort of a litre of oil every 1,000 miles, which is way in excess of what an engine should be using. And these are vehicles, by the way, with less than 100,000 miles. We're talking engines that have done 50 or in some cases only 40,000 miles suffering with this oil consumption. Now, there are two reasons for this. The first one, which is the least common but always needs checking, they do suffer with a PCV valve which can fail. This is a little sort of orange diaphragm that sits inside the rock cover gasket. Now, these can actually fail and cause excessive oil consumption, so that is always worth checking. They're actually very cheap and easy to replace, and if you have got an engine that is using too much oil, that is definitely where I'd be going first to check that out and replace it. Like I said, it's not too expensive to sort. Now, although replacing that PCV valve may help with some of the oil consumption and in some cases may rectify the issue, it's definitely not the main culprit behind oil consumption with these engines. In fact, the main culprit is to do with the piston rings. Now, it's been widely reported by people in the trade, mechanics, something that I've seen firsthand, speaking to Peugeot Citroen mechanics, and also customers who have actually spoken to dealers and they've come back and told them that the problem is down to piston rings, that the engine seems to have a fundamental problem where effectively the rings are effectively failing far too prematurely, and it's allowing oil to pass through the actual rings themselves, and that is effectively burning all the oil away. Now, when they become really bad, the actual engines can start smoking, and I've seen this firsthand. In fact, only just a few weeks ago again, I actually went round the corner to my local garage to pick an MOT up, and in there was a Vauxhalls Grandland, which is fitted with the same 1.2 Puretech engine. And as I was speaking to the mechanic there, talking about the engine, all the issues with them, which he was sort of agreeing with me and saying, yes, they are basically a load of rubbish. As we nickname them in the trade, we call them pure crap engines, not pure tech. And as we're having this conversation and basically talking about the customer brought this vehicle in and he was saying he was using too much oil, next thing you know, the engine started spewing out smoke out of nowhere, just randomly, and basically clogging up the entire garage with smoke. And this was a 18 plate car with about 50,000 miles on, and basically now is condemned. This is the sort of thing that's happening all the time. Like I said, oil consumption, smoky engines. However, it doesn't end there, because these engines also suffer with oil clogging problems. That's where basically the engine gets clogged up with really thick gummy oil, and that is caused by the wet belt or cam belt system effectively failing and basically stripping off bits of rubber off the belt, getting stuck into the oil galleys and the oil ways and the oil pickup and clogging up the engine and effectively destroying it, causing oil pressure problems, and even can cause braking issues as well, where you effectively lose all the brakes. And you heard me right when I said wet belt. Yes, the Peugeot Citroen Puretech engine shares a common component with the Ford EcoBoost engine. The 1 litre EcoBoost engine uses a wet belt, and so does the 1.2 Puretech engine. There is a bit of a theme going on here. These wet belt systems are, in my view, absolutely terrible designs. I don't know who'd come up with the idea. It's like basically some engineers in 2000 met up from Peugeot and Ford and thought, let's start making engines with these wet belts in. They are rubbish. They basically just fall to pieces. Oil and rubber is not a good mixture, and like the Ford EcoBoost, they just strip the belts to pieces and it all ends up in this sump, gets into all the oil ways and clogs and destroys the engine. Now, don't get me wrong, if you service these engines properly and use the correct oil, you will minimize the deterioration of the wet belt. However, I have seen numerous accounts and seen firsthand people who have only gone to Peugeot Citroen, full service history, everything done on time, used all the correct parts, and still had issues with the wet belts basically destroying themselves, and in some cases complete engine failure. So please do not think if you service them regular that you are immune from this problem. I've seen it firsthand. Trust me, they still go wrong. It will minimize it. Of course, servicing will help, but it will not eradicate the problem. In my view, there is a fundamental design flaw with these wet belt engines. They're just not up to the task. Now, the wet belt system used on these Peugeot Citroens originally was supposed to be changed sort of every 112,000 miles, although some specialists out there are now saying you should be changing them every 60,000 miles and 6 years because of the premature wear to them. And that is something that I definitely will agree with. However, unlike the Ford EcoBoost wet belt system, it isn't all that bad necessarily with this 1.2 wet belt system, because one, they are very easy to check and examine. In fact, you can even check and examine them yourself. It's really easy to do, and they're actually quite cheap to replace. In fact, I got a quote actually the other day for a 1.2 Puretech Peugeot Citroen to have a cam belt changed at the main agents, and it was only 500 quid with genuine parts fitted. So they're actually a lot cheaper than, for instance, having the wet belt changed on a 1 litre EcoBoost, which is probably like $1.5 to $2 grand to have done at the dealership. That is a massive strip down on the Ford because it is actually buried in the engine. At least this Peugeot Citroen Puretech engine, the belts are in a conventional place on the left side of the engine if you open the bonnet, accessible. It's no different than really changing a normal cam belt, it's just it's submerged in oil. So at least, like I said, they are very cheap to replace. So in practice, if you're going to buy one, I'll be making sure the belt is being changed, and I would certainly be changing it a lot earlier. If you do that, you're going to resolve the issue of basically the engine's clogging up and having issues with basically the belt actually failing and causing damage to the engine. So that is at least some positive, and like I said, you can inspect these yourself. Basically take the oil cap off and you'll be able to see the actual wet belt itself. You can see where it is. There are even tools you can buy to actually test the actual belt to see sort of how much movement or play is in the belt, but you can actually physically examine it. It's easy to see. If you see any cracking or perishing or anything like that, bits of material coming off or it looks frayed, you need to be getting that belt replaced. So at least that is a good thing that you can inspect the belt. It's easy to see, so you can keep an eye on it going forward. So as you mentioned earlier, I will not buy vehicles fitted with this 1.2 Puretech engine. Now you could just say, well Lee, why don't you just change the belts on every single one, and then you haven't got anything to worry about. It's not particularly expensive. If it's only 500 quid to have it done at the main agents, we'd be able to do that for a fraction of the price. In fact, it's no difficult than changing most conventional cam belts, which you would do anyway. Well, yes, that would be great if that was the only issue. We basically buy them and just say, look, unless they've got paperwork saying they've been changed recently, just change every single one, build it into your price, and you can sell them, and you're probably able to build that into the price when you sell it as well, and the confidence that someone's buying a car that's had the belt replaced and no worry. Well, that would be great. Like I said, it's not the only issue. Go back to those other problems we mentioned earlier: oil consumption and also smoky engines. There is no way of telling when I buy one of these cars from auction, even if the belt's been replaced, if there's an issue with it using too much oil. The only way you're going to know that is by running it for a period of time, and if you sold it to a customer and they come back to you sort of 6 to 8 months later saying it's using lots of oil, even that far down the line, there's a chance that that fault may have already been there when they purchased the vehicle. That could mean me having to get involved, now having to fix it or repair it, and like I said, most of the times when it's doing this, it basically needs a new engine if it's using far more oil than the recommended allowance. And then you've also got the smoking issue as well. You might buy an engine that's running all right and then all of a sudden start sporadically smoking, which I've seen often happen. And trust me, they only seem to get worse, and you'll never be able to rectify it without replacing the engine unit. And that is the main reason why I will not buy them, because like I said, you don't want to sell one and then you get a phone call 6 months later saying it's burning oil or it's using too much oil. What are you going to do about it? Which is a real shame, because they are fitted to some real great little cars, and sadly this engine seems to be finding its way into other vehicles as well, now into sort of Fiat and also some of the Jeep products, because it's built into the Peugeot Citroen group, the Stellantis group that owns Citroen, Peugeot, Opel, Vauxhalls, Fiat, sort of all one big conglomerate. But what happens if you've already bought one of these vehicles? Well, like I said, make sure you check the belt out properly. Make sure you're having it serviced properly. If you've never had the belt replaced, I will not be working to the recommended mileage given by Peugeot Citroen. I will be getting it placed a lot sooner, to be honest with you. And like I said, it's not too expensive to do. It will save you a packet of money if that engine ever went wrong. And trust me, they do go wrong a lot. If you're buying new, I would not be too worried, to be honest with you. Most of the faults that seem to be occurring seem to be sort of 5 year plus onwards with higher mileage engines, sort of 50,000 miles plus. There are some exceptions I've seen under that. But like I said, if you're buying it new anyway and it's on lease or anything like that, the first 3 years you're covered under the manufacturer's warranty. I wouldn't worry too much there. It's more the used market that I would be really concerned about when buying one of these engines. And also it is worth mentioning as well that in late 2020-21, they did improve this engine and supposedly have rectified some of the main issues that has been facing it. And to date, there hasn't too many reports of engines going wrong, but like I said, it's still early days yet. So let's see what happens. Hopefully they have eradicated a lot of the problems that they've been facing over the last sort of 10 years of this engine, because the idea and concept of it is brilliant, to have an engine that is lightweight, sort of not quite peppy and fun to drive, and like I said, they do drive really well. And hopefully if they have eradicated those issues, maybe in the future these might be vehicles that I can then buy with confidence and be able to sell to customers. But for the moment, I will definitely be staying well clear of these engines in my line of work. Anyway, that is my view of the PSA 1.2 Puretech engine. Now, if you've had any issues with a 1.2 Puretech engine or the 1 litre in the early days, let me know in the comments. Let me hear your stories. It'd be interesting to hear people's views of this engine. Whether it's positive or negative, I would love to hear in the comments. So let me know, guys. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you all in the next one.